Good morning, First Christian. Welcome to our Sunday school class as we're going through the book of 2 Kings. We're going to be in chapter 5 today, and so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about the story of Naaman and his miraculous healing from leprosy. So let's start and read chapter 5, verses 1 through 5.
Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means, go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing.
Okay, so one of the things that's interesting about this story is that at first glance, it's hard for us as modern people to relate to it at all. First of all, you have Naaman. He's the commander of the army of the king of Aram or Syria. And so these guys, at the time that this story takes place, there's a lot of warfare going on between them and Israel. So these are enemies of Israel. And one of the clues that you have to the fact that that's the case is this servant girl. How does she end up in Naaman's service? Captive. She's captive, right? So that's the way things worked back then. As you'd send out these kingdoms, would send out these raiding parties, and they would go to like these little border areas and destroy the village and kill the men and take all the crops and all the valuables and steal any of the people that they wanted to bring back and put them and make them slaves in service. So for us, I mean, probably the closest thing that we've ever experienced in this is, talking about or watching what's happening with ISIS. Back a few years ago when ISIS was taking over more and more land, this is one of the things that they used to do. They would go and they would attack a city or a village, and if these people were of a different religious persuasion than them, they'd either put them to death or sell them into slavery or do these kinds of things. Now, would you think of those kinds of people as the kind of people you would want to help out? No. I mean, probably not. Imagine if, the Canadians got tired of being called America's hat and decided to start, raiding places like, Michigan. And,
They can have Michigan.
Right. Yeah, they better watch their step if they're going to Michigan. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But imagine Americans being carried off into captivity and being made slaves up there. Like, we would have a lot of animosity towards that. And so the thing is, when we read these scriptures, there's a tendency for us to go, oh, okay, well, they're telling us what's happening, so we just go along with it. But it's important to kind of put yourself back in that time period and put it in a context that would make sense, is that this is a kind of normal thing back then, but it's not like it would make you friends. So in that context, you have this guy named Naaman, and he's got leprosy, and we think of leprosy as Hansen's disease, which is a modern thing that we call leprosy, but it's not biblical leprosy. So modern Hansen's disease is a disease that affects your nerve endings, and I guess you guys are reading a book about that right now, and it basically makes it so you can't feel, and parts of your flesh decay and fall off and stuff like that because you get wounded and don't realize it, and then infections develop and things like that. Well, that's not what this is. So biblical leprosy was kind of almost like a super severe psoriasis, and it was a condition that would make your skin white and the hair white, and apparently it would also make it somehow transparent so that you could see the flesh underneath. Now, we're not sure whether that meant that like sores were opening up and you could see the flesh underneath, or whether the skin was kind of becoming a little bit transparent. But it's clear from Leviticus that part of this is that you could see the flesh. And so it was a disease that apparently would kind of take over and spread in your body, and it was considered, it made you ceremonially unclean.
Was it contagious then to others? Is that why they kept him in
Possibly. See, the hard thing is that the idea of contagion isn't really well established or explained in that. Apparently, they viewed it as something that could spread, but whether it actually could or not, or that's the way that it was treated. So one of the things that's important, and let's go ahead and we'll get to this verse now. So let's look at Leviticus chapter 13. We're going to skip way ahead in our verse list, but this is a good time to address this. So Leviticus chapter 13, and we'll start in verse 1, and this is kind of some of the prohibitions or some of the laws about leprosy. So let's go ahead and read that.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priests, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. And if the hair in the diseased area has turned white, and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a case of leprous disease. When the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if the spot is white in the skin of his body, and appears no deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest shall shut up the diseased person for 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day, and if in his eyes the disease is checked, and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall shut him up for another 7 days. And the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day. And if the diseased area has faded, and the disease has not spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only an eruption, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the eruption spreads in the skin, after he has shown himself to the priest for his cleansing, he shall appear again before the priest, and the priest shall look, and if the eruption has spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous disease.
Okay, so a lot of things going on there, and there's two things that are going on. There's the health aspect of this, and then there's the ceremonial aspect of this. And so this is a disease that's not a common disease now. We don't really know what this was. It's possible that there was some kind of a bacterial infection that was around back then that's no longer around. We don't really know. But from the ceremonial aspect of it, first of all, this made you unclean. And uncleanness in the Old Testament was associated with death. So the idea of uncleanness is the idea of death. So when anything makes you unclean or can spread like uncleanness, the idea here is that death is something that's always there, and death is something that can kind of infect you. And once death infects you, you have to be separated from the rest of the community because death spreads. Okay, and so you can think about that as an infectious disease, and it makes sense. But that's not really the full story when it comes to this in the Old Testament, because there was a symbolic and ceremonial aspect to this. And the idea is that, so uncleanness is associated with dirt, and dirt is associated with the curse. Okay, so if you go all the way back to Genesis and you think about both the curse on Adam, he's going to have to work the ground, and by the sweat of his brow he's going to toil, and he's going to have to do that to get crops. And also, if you think about Cain and Abel and how the ground cried out with the blood of Abel, and the idea here is that the ground testifies against us about the curse. And so uncleanness, dirtiness, and death are all associated with each other, because the idea here is that in the Old Testament, death was what happened when spirit and flesh, or spirit and dust, or spirit and matter, when those things were divided from each other, that was death. Okay, so if you think about it from a modern perspective, okay, so let's say that John is sleeping. Okay, because I've seen that happen a few times. Okay, so we're at the water park, and John is sitting there on the bench, and I go, okay, well, let me take one look around for somebody was missing, and I went and found him at the lockers and came back, and in that amount of time, it was a very short time, I came back and John was asleep. So,
He did that very well.
yes, he was very good at that. And so we go there and we go to wake up John. Okay, John wakes up. So what's the difference between John asleep and some other guy that is on the bench and that dies? Like, when John's asleep, he's not dead, but he also is not aware of his surroundings. He's, you know what I'm saying? So what's the difference between him and some guy who's sitting next to him that maybe keeled over and died? In trying to explain medically exactly what death is actually a difficult thing. Now, we have our standards of what death looks like, but sometimes they apply those standards and they find out some guy wasn't actually dead. That happens every once in a while. And in fact, I just read not too long ago about the story about a guy who was actually at a mortuary and woke up in a casket. I can't remember if it was a guy or a girl, but that happened fairly recently where they were declared dead and they woke up. So clearly, medically, we don't always know exactly how to parse death and living. From the standpoint of a theological definition, death is when the spirit and the body, the flesh, are separated. And the reason that that's death is because the idea is that without the spirit, the flesh actually is dead. The flesh can't do anything without the spirit. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about plants, animals, or people. Without the spirit, you have death. And the spirit, remember, is everything that's not physical. And so information is one of the things that's spiritual, right? So the DNA sequence, it's not the actual, chromosomes and all that kind of stuff. It's the sequence, which is information, that is completely necessary for that. The physical side of the DNA strand is just the means by which that is recorded and expressed, but it's the actual information that brings life to that lifeless thing. Does that make sense? And so the idea here is that when you have a separation of spirit and flesh, you have death, and death is always associated with the flesh side of things. The spirit is life. You can't talk about spirit and death because spirit is life. And flesh needs spirit in order to live. Okay, so the idea behind that then is that leprosy is basically a false glory that actually leads to death. Okay, so why do we say false glory? Well, because in biblical language, in theological language, white is associated with glory. Okay? So, for instance, when we die and we get taken into heaven, one of the things that happens is we're given white robes. Why are we given white robes?
We symbolize purity.
Right, so it symbolizes purity. Clean, right? So the thing is that when if you go out in the sun and you're wearing white robe, versus if you're wearing, blue or you're wearing brown, right? There's a reflection of light. If you've ever experienced that, yeah. Or we used to have this thing happen in the spring when I lived in Colorado. Is I had a lot of friends that would ski, and in the springtime they would come back with just the most intense tans, sometimes the most intense sunburns. And they would always have this raccoon look because they had their sunglasses on, and they were actually out skiing, and sometimes they would ski in their shorts. Because by the time spring rolled around, you were used to the colder weather. It started to warm up, the sun was out, but the snow hadn't yet melted, and they would go skiing, and the reflection off the white snow was so intense that they would get these incredible either sunburns or tans, depending on how careful they were. Right? So white reflects that. So it's associated with glory. So this is a white thing, which should be glorious, but it actually leads to death. So if you think about it in those terms, what is a false glory that leads to death? What would we call that? A false glory that leads to death.
Riches?
Okay, so riches could be a form of it. What else?
Fame?
Okay, sin. Well, it would be a sin, but we're trying to get maybe a little bit narrower look. What did you say?
Fame. Fame?
Okay, fame, riches. So we're talking about basically like pride, like hubris, like, you know what I'm saying? Taking pride in the wrong thing. So we can look at it kind of this way. You can have a situation where you have a rich guy who is proud of what he's done, and it's a false glory. And you can have another rich guy who's proud of what he's done, and maybe it's actually a true glory. Like, what's the difference between those two things?
Visible difference? Is that what you're talking about?
No, just from the standpoint of how would you know the difference? Let's say this. Let's say you guys have your daughter is going to get married, and there's two guys that come to her, and they're both wealthy, and they're both proud of their accomplishments. Can you imagine a possibility, a realm where you say, okay, yeah, I want you to marry this rich guy, but I definitely don't want you to marry that rich guy? Like, what would the differences between those two guys be?
Their spirit.
Okay, their spirit. So the thing is, let's say some guy got super rich playing cards, or inherited money from his dad, trust fund kid, or he won the lottery, let's say, and he's super proud of his wealth, and he's proud of his car, and he's proud of his jet, and he's proud of all those kinds of things, and he's proud of how much money he spends, and he's got all kinds of, his Instagram account is full of like him putting piles of money into the toilet and lighting them on fire because like he's got so much money he can just burn it, and he's got all that. And then another guy is proud of the fact that he's developed, let's say, a new software that really helps to streamline this industry. You know what I'm saying? So what we're talking about here is that there's the root of glory, and then there's the fruit of glory. And there's a tendency for us as people to take pride in the wrong things. You understand what I'm saying? Sure. You can take pride in the fact that you have a really fancy car, or you can take pride in the fact that you manufacture fancy cars and you do it to the best way that you possibly can. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a difference in the way that you view those things, and so you can think about somebody who is, a politician. That might be a good one. That is very proud of their poll numbers and very proud of their way to finagle things and talk their way out of problems and all that kind of stuff. And maybe you have another politician who's very proud of the way that he serves his constituents and he tries to do the right. You know what I'm saying? Both of those people can take pride in something, and it's not necessarily wrong to take pride in glory. The problem is that there's a false glory and then there's a true glory. Am I making this kind of clear? Okay. So thinking about that, all these things in the Bible are symbolic. So what might we figure out about Naaman that would associate him with this kind of false glory? What is it about Naaman? What do we know? What do we learn about Naaman in the very first paragraph?
Mighty man of valor.
He's a mighty man of valor, okay? So he goes out there and he's a brave guy, and maybe he's a great warrior. Maybe he can take on 5 or 6 guys and beat them all and kill them all. Okay? So is there anything wrong with being brave and having valor and being mighty? Is there anything wrong with that?
No, it actually says in my version too that he was a great and honorable man.
Yeah, so there's an honor to him. And yet, what we'll see is that there's also some problems here. So he has honor among his people and everything, but hopefully as we go through the story, you'll start to get little pieces of what might be the problem. So keep your eye out for that as we go through the story. Try to think about, well, what might be the problem here? Because in the Bible, these things are always, it's not random, okay? These things are told to us to give us clues in understanding wisdom. So let's go ahead and read verse 6 and 7.
And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me.
Okay, so the king of Israel gets this letter. Hey, I'm sending all this stuff with my great servant Naaman. Go ahead and cure him. Okay, and So these guys are border enemies, and they're having these disputes and these raids. And obviously the king of Israel, he immediately thinks, well, this guy's just seeking a reason, a provocation to come and fight me and take over my country. Right? So he's terrified. All right, let's read 8 through, that's 14, 8 through 14.
But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots, and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, Wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean.
All right. So, did we get any clues in that passage about what the issue here was with Naaman? Why the issue of false glory? Pride, yes.
The way she read it was exactly how it made complete sense to that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so the pride is the issue, because basically he's like, I'm a great man,
Yeah.
and this guy
They came all
needs to come out here in front of me. So basically he wants to treat Elisha as his servant.
Right.
And there's a contradiction going on in his thinking, where he thinks that the God of Israel is great enough to heal his leprosy, but yet the man that's the servant of the God of Israel should think so much of Naaman that he has to come out and he has to face him and be, and address him as if he's Naaman's servant. That there's a problem here. He thinks so highly of himself. Now it's not that he's without honor. He obviously, to be an honorable person, you need to keep your word, you need to do all those things, but you can be very proud of your own honor, right? And that seems to be the problem here with Naaman. And it almost keeps him from getting cured, because he says, our rivers in Damascus are better than the Jordan. Jordan's not known as a very, clean and pretty river. And so he's like, hey, and so here, this kind of helps us to see the problem. So there's 2 problems that we want to see here. First of all is the problem with the king of Israel. So the king of Israel says, oh man, this guy's just trying to, who am I, God? I can't cure this guy. This guy's just trying to pick a fight with me. All right, so what did God set apart Israel for? What was the reason that God said, I'm going to bless you guys and make your name great. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. We're going to do all this. If you go all the way back to the promise to Abraham, why is God interested in doing what he's doing for Israel?
So that they're a witness to the nations.
Yeah, they're supposed to be a witness to the nations. And here you have the perfect scenario where a guy comes to you and basically says, hey man, we've heard that there's prophets here and that this guy can be cured, and you have people from a nation that's your enemy that's coming and inquiring about what God can do. And if this king had faith, then what he'd be saying is, this is the perfect opportunity, because once we show him the power of God, then we won't have to worry about our citizens being carried off by them. We're not going to be at war anymore. We'll be at peace. This is the perfect opportunity to turn an enemy into an ally, and to turn a nation that's against God into a nation that serves God. This is what we've always been hoping for. This is what the whole thing's about. And instead, because he doesn't have any faith, it's like it's an emergency on his part. This is terrible. And so Elisha comes along and goes, what are you doing? This is exactly what God is interested in. So send him to me. And so that's the problem with the king. But then the problem with Naaman is that he's looking at the river as the source of the healing and not at God. He says, look, this river is dirty. I have clean rivers back home. I'm not going to do this. Right? as if the river is the reason that he's going to be healed. As if somehow anybody with leprosy, all they have to do is come dip themselves in the Jordan and they're going to be healed. If that were true, then there wouldn't be any lepers in Israel. And if that were true, everybody would know, hey, if you got leprosy, go to the Jordan. It doesn't have anything to do with the water. It has to do with the word that God speaks. That's what the issue here is, right? And so the problem is that that's the issue of the false glory. So you know that you're dealing with false glory when the glory is in physical things and not the spiritual things that the physical things embody. Okay, so as an example, you can take, let's say, you can spend a crazy amount of money on almost anything. There's expensive cars, there's expensive houses, there's expensive cigars, there's expensive things. Now, let's say you get a cabinet, some cabinets made. You have a den and you get some cabinets and some shelves made, and you have a guy come in there, or even better yet, I've got a real example. I was watching a documentary about this guy who made these gardens. He was a rich guy, and he got soured on business, and he decided to devote himself to gardening. And so he made these crazy gardens in Canada, at his property in Canada, and he wanted to do a Japanese-inspired one or section to his garden. And so he wanted some Japanese buildings. And so instead of, just drawing up something and, oh, this looks Japanese, can I hire a contractor to build this? He found a guy in California that was a descendant of Japanese carpenters and said, hey, can you build me a house? And the guy goes, yeah, the problem is it's going to take 2 years. And the guy said, well, why is it going to take 2 years? And he said, well, the first thing I have to do is start selecting the logs, and I cut them and I let them sit for a year so that they dry properly. And then it's going to take me, once I get to I'll bring them to the site and I'll do the final fitting and everything and final assembly, and that's going to take a year. Now, these buildings weren't very big. These are kind of like a little bit more than a gazebo, but much less than a house. The guy's going to take a year to put them up. And the reason is because in traditional Japanese carpentry, you don't use any nails. And all the boards, all the wood all the beams and everything have to fit together very, very accurately. And then you use wooden dowels to hold the things together. Okay, so I have no idea how much money he spent on these two little buildings, but it was a lot, because you got to pay a guy for 2 years basically, but at least a year of the assembly. Here's the thing. Now, is there glory in that? Is the glory in the actual building itself, or is the glory in the mastery, the carpentry, the knowledge, the skill? You see what I'm saying? So
I would say it's in both.
Right.
More in the latter and less in the former.
Right. So here's the thing. If you have one of those buildings built and you've paid money for that, and you can show it to everybody, look at my building, and you can describe the way it was built and all this kind of stuff, and you can say, this building is mine, and so therefore it reflects my glory. But that's a false glory, because it assumes that because you own the physical structure that you own the glory. Who's the one who actually owns the glory of that building?
The builder.
The builder, right? And even beyond the builder, now the builder can take pride in that, but it's not even so much resting in the builder, it's resting in those principles of craftsmanship and skill. You know what I'm saying? That he's dedicated himself to and submitted himself to those things. Does that make sense? So that's the problem. So you can always recognize false glory when it's one thing to own like a fine. I was watching a video about a watch that this really fancy watch company built, and it took them 7 years to make this watch. Okay, and it's amazing how many complications, and it's got glass on the front and on the back, because you can see through the glass on the back, all of the complicated movements and everything. It took him 2 years to design all of the mechanical stuff inside of it, and then it took him 5 years to actually construct the watch. If you buy that, you can have the attitude of I paid this money because this level of craftsmanship, this level, there's a glory there that's worth it. And you can be showing people the glory of that. Or you can buy that watch and be like, look at how good I am. I've got this watch. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference in giving glory to the people who built it or even the principles, the spiritual ideals that it represents. Or there's a glory that you think comes on you because you have the physical object. And so you know when false glory is happening because you can see the difference between those two things. So when we go into the sanctuary today and we worship God, we're taking, it's a good practice because it takes the attention off of us. It takes the attention off of who we are and the things that we represent, and it takes the attention off of the flesh and puts it on the Spirit. You know, God, we're worshiping God who is the God of truth and the God of mercy and the God of justice and the God of grace, right? We're worshiping the God of love. We're worshiping these spiritual things that are the things that are worthy of glory because they glorify the physical world with their presence. And when the physical world submits to those things, it gains glory.
We're the watch and God is the watchmaker.
Right, exactly. So we don't give glory to ourselves. We give glory to the thing that created us and allows us, to the extent that we have any glory at all, it's because we've submitted ourselves to Him. And so that's kind of what's happening here. Now, what's going to happen is that you're going to see at the end of this story that there's a twist here, and this twist is an important thing for us to watch because we'll see that somebody who should know better is going to fall into the same trap that Naaman fell. Okay, so let's read verses 15 through the end of the chapter, because it's all really one long narration.
Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant. But he said, As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, If not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He said to him, Go in peace. But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, and the man of God, said, See, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. So Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, Is all well? And he said, All is well. My master has sent me to say, There have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. And Naaman said, Be pleased to accept 2 talents. And he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with the 2 changes of clothing and laid them on 2 of his servants. And they carried them before Gehazi, and when he came to the hill, he took them from their hand and put them in the house. And he sent the men away, and they departed. He went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, Where have you been, Gehazi? And he said, Your servant went nowhere. But he said to him, Did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you, and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence a leper like snow.
All right, so in the end of the story, everything, and again, the Bible's always putting this stuff where it's putting it for a reason. The end of the story is all about, again, this idea of false glory and how you deal with false glory. So first of all, what we see here is that Naaman wants to give Elisha payment for this, and Elisha won't accept it. Now, the issue is that, is it always sinful for a prophet to receive a gift or something like that from somebody who's grateful for what they've done?
No.
I don't think so.
Okay, no, I don't think so either, because there's other times in scriptures where they receive something, and in fact, a lot of times the prophets lived off of the donations of people. So it's not necessarily that it's always wrong. So the question is, so why is Elisha not accepting it in this instance? In fact, he says at the end here, he says, was it a time to accept money and garments? So the idea is that this wasn't the time, this wasn't appropriate at this time to accept these things. So why isn't it the time to do that?
I don't know, I look at it kind of as a statement that you don't have to buy healing.
Okay.
It's just your faith that takes care of it.
Okay. Yeah, the issue here, I think, is along those lines. It's that you have a guy whose problem has been a false pride in physical things, and to accept a physical gift from him could reinforce in him this idea that somehow the gift and the spiritual gift are somehow on equal terms. And you don't want him to do that. You want him to understand that, these physical things, they're nothing without the Spirit. The Spirit is everything. And I have the Spirit of God. I live in the presence. I worship. And so I don't need these things. These things are not, there's not an equal, this isn't payment. Okay? It's not like I've given you something and you've given me something of equal value. That's not what it is. And so I'm not even going to take this from you.
It's not an exchange.
Yes, it's not an exchange. That's the way it should be put. Yeah, and so he's wanting to emphasize that. Now what happens is you have this issue of Naaman saying he wants these 2 mule loads of dirt because now he's probably going to put those on the ground so that he's worshiping from Israel, so to speak. And Elisha's like, okay, that's fine. And he also wants a pardon for when he goes with his master into Ramon and has to hold him as he bows, because there's going to be some bowing there. And he's saying, I want you to forgive me for this. Now, why would Elisha... It's interesting that throughout the Old Testament, idol worship is something that you just don't engage in. And he's kind of, forgiving him for having to go into this, idol worship. And why would he... In keeping with this idea of glory and what's false glory and true glory, why would he say, "Hey, I'm going to grant you forgiveness for this. I'm going to absolve you from this"? What's the distinction that Naaman's actually making? That's an important distinction about worship and the Spirit.
Well, he feels he knows what's wrong, and he's asking for forgiveness
Right.
in advance.
Right, and by knowing that it's wrong, and by saying that, I only want to worship the God of Israel, but I kind of have to do this thing. I think what Elisha is drawing the distinction of is that worship, true worship, is actually a worship that's done in spirit and in truth. Okay, that's what Jesus will say later on in his ministry, right? And the idea here is that it's not going through the actions. Those are physical things. That's not true worship. True worship is not going through the actions. It's where your heart is. It's in the things that you actually value, the things that you actually ascribe value and glory to. That's worship is declaring the worth of something. And it's not going through the actions of declaring worth. It's what you actually value that's important. And since this guy is saying, hey, look, I'm going to have to do this, but understand that I really only want to worship the God of Israel. He's basically, and Elisha's saying, okay, I'm going to grant you that. He's honoring this distinction between elevating this distinction between what you sometimes might have to do physically, or what sometimes the physical side of life is, versus what really worship constitute, which is not the physical side of life, but the spiritual side of life. Just because somebody comes into our sanctuary doesn't mean that they're worshiping. And in the same vein, he could go into this sanctuary of an idol and not worship at all. And the thing is, as a Christian, if somebody who's a friend of yours or whatever says, hey, come worship in my religion one day, and I'll come and worship in your religion one day, you could, as a Christian, you could go into a temple. I've been into temples that weren't to my God, and I didn't worship. I didn't go in there and say, oh, wow, this is a great God, and I really give praise to this God. I wasn't thinking that at all. I was there, I was watching, I was seeing what was happening, but I didn't worship there. And so, in the same way, that's what the spiritual side of things are what's really important. All right, now, finally, this issue here of Gehazi and Gehazi's greed. So why does Gehazi end up being the one with the leprosy?
Well, he ends up doing the very thing that Naaman initially started out thinking.
Yeah.
He's embraced the mindset of Naaman.
It totally embraced the mindset of Naaman, right? He doesn't say, look at the God that I serve. Look at the glory of the God that I serve. That he can clean somebody in a river like the Jordan, that somebody could come out of that clean. I serve a God that is so powerful and so awesome and is full of grace and mercy. I worship a God that is above every other God. And he could say, isn't it great that I have this position of being able to work with Elisha and see these things firsthand, to see these miracles and see the power of God. And he could say, this is payment beyond anything else. But instead, what is his mind on? His mind is on the physical things. Look at the riches that Naaman has. And so he ends up, because he takes on the mindset of Naaman, he ends up with the disease of Naaman. And so this is one of those things that it's important when we read the Bible that we understand that the Bible, once again, it makes complete sense. It's very cohesive. Now, we come to the Bible a lot of times and we can't make heads or tails of it, but a lot of times that's because we have not looked at the way that the Bible lays out its symbols. And so it's almost like a language we don't understand. And so once you understand the symbols, then you can understand the word. So we'll stop there for today. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll be done. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the word that you've given us. Help us to take glory in the things that have true worth, and help us to glory in the Spirit. Help us, Father, as we go into our worship time, to worship in spirit and truth. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.